So you want to make a hacky GMS port to Android from Windows. But you have no knowledge of Game Maker Studio. You don't have the source code and you don't know where to start. First of all, you should acquire an empty Android wrapper, either by compiling a brand new GMS project, or by downloading one of the pre-existing ports and gutting its files. An important thing to note is that you should use the appropriate version of the Game Maker Studio to create a wrapper, meaning that your Game Maker Studio version should be newer than the one used to compile the original game. I will leave a link to one of the relatively newer versions of the empty wrapper in the description. Alright, so you got your wrapper APK. I won't ask you where you got it, cause we both know you wouldn't compile it from scratch, even though a manually compiled wrapper has a couple of advantages. When you open it up in WinRAR, the internal structure should look something like this. We are interested in the assets folder, as that's the folder where the game files will be stored in the future. Let's return to the installation folder of the Windows game we want to port. I will be using Valhalla as the example. The core file of the game itself is called DataWin. Copy that file directly into the assets folder of the APK, and rename it to GameKeyboard. Now we have to figure out which files are actually important to the game. The process of figuring out which is pure trial and error. Basically, experiment and use common sense. You will have to do that a lot in order to make a successful port. For example, DLL and EXE files are only usable by Windows, so we do not need to copy them over to the assets folder of our APK. Once you're done, you've got an APK loaded with the game files. You won't be able to install it just yet, however. Android checks the integrity of APK files by using signatures. We could have used the slow way of using AAPT to properly package the APK, but I prefer directly signing the package. Use Zip Signer or an alternative program to sign APK directly, and install the signed package. If it runs, congratulations, now the fun starts. And when I say fun, I mean debugging and troubleshooting. Now I will describe common issues you may encounter after you've successfully launched the game on your Android device. One of the most common issues when porting over a game made in Game Maker Studio is lack of controls. Even when you connect a gamepad or a keyboard, the game remains unresponsive. The most important problem is that Android keycodes do not coincide with Windows keycodes. Whenever the game expects the player pressing a key, it usually expects the Windows keycode for it. Moreover, in the games that feature remappable controls, you can't remap the controls, since the game doesn't recognize the input device. There are a couple of ways around it. I recommend using GameKeyboard to temporarily manually reassign hardware key mappings. It will act as a translating layer between Windows and Android keycodes. You can just use macros to reassign every button to the keycodes you want, but it's not what you want to be doing most of the time. Macros have limited time period, meaning you can't vary the time the button is held down. For example, if you assign the jump button to a macro, you won't be able to vary the height or duration of your jump by holding it more or less time. The game will also not register whether the button is held down, instead assuming that you've let it go once the macro duration ended, forcing you to repeatedly press it. So you want to be using actual Android key bindings to properly emulate key presses. The problem with it is that Android also has quite a lot of system keys that are used to launch other apps, close them and otherwise interfere with your game. There is an easy solution, however. I've compiled a short list of corresponding Android and Windows key codes, and you can see that I've highlighted some of them with green. Basically, those highlighted key codes are safe to use, since they don't overlap with any Android or Windows system keys. For any Windows game that features remappable controls, you can just use a single GameKeyboard profile with those specific buttons mapped onto your gamepad, and then manually change the controls in the game config files to match the GameKeyboard profile. I will leave a link to my shortened list and the complete lists of key event codes for both Windows and Android in the description. Another common issue of Android hack job ports is the way GMS wrapper treats touchscreen inputs. As you might have guessed, touching the screen somewhere emulates a left mouse button click at that position. The problem with it is that the wrapper registers a click before actually moving the cursor, meaning you can accidentally click stuff you never intended to. This also means that quick swipes do not work as expected, and that if you have to drag something on the screen, you have to do it carefully. There is no current known fix for this that I know of, and if someone figures it out, I would be the first to shake that man's hand. So let's say you want to make multiple ports with the same wrapper. Everything works just fine, but there's just one problem. The wrapper package names overlap. So when you try to install two ports side by side, the second port attempts to overwrite the first. Thankfully, that can be solved in many ways. You can refactor the package in Android Studio and set it to a custom name, or you can use one of the available app cloners to change the package name for you by a couple letters, so that game installs don't interfere with each other. While you're at it, you can also change the icon and displayed name of your app. Also, while we're at the topic of customization, there is one thing I forgot to mention. Aside from the game files themselves, another two files are also located in the Assets folder /png and Portrait/png. Those are responsible for the image shown when the game is initially loading. You don't need to change them, but it makes for a better experience, so why not just be sure to use a PNG in proper resolution and aspect ratio. As most of the Game Maker wrappers force or otherwise require landscape orientation, you can get away with replacing just /png and ignoring Portrait/png. With most of the games written in GMS, you won't be able to remap your in-game controls manually by pressing on your gamepad whenever it asks to press the key, since even if the GMS wrapper recognizes the key codes you are sending, it often doesn't recognize the input device itself, whether it's a physical gamepad or a touchscreen keyboard. So you will have to manually change the configuration files on your own, and then bake them into UAPK. With some games, like Risk of Rain, it's easy. The input configs are easily accessible in prefscene file that spawns directly in the game folder, meaning you can just launch the game once, spawn the prefscene config, change it to your liking and copy it to the Assets folder of your APK. With some games like Nidhogg, it's considerably harder, since they store config files in the Windows App Data folder, which you need to locate and figure out where the corresponding file spawns in your Android App Data folder. Then you have to figure out where exactly the strings for keycodes are located in the config file, possibly having to manually remap every control value on PC in order for relevant strings to appear, and replace the config file that spawns on Android with the already redacted file. Thankfully, you can just include said file with the assets instead of navigating the Android root folders. And some of the games, like Undertale, just don't have remappable controls, meaning you are stuck with assigning specific key codes, often via macros, and there is very little you can do about it. This covers most of the topics I've wanted to mention. I will be washing my hands of the whole Game Maker business and expanding to more gaming related topics, both Android and otherwise, but I didn't want the acquired knowledge going to waste. Leave comments if you want a specific question answered. So yeah, there you go. Thanks for watching. See ya.